and welcome to Fierce Reads Presents YA Fantasy and the Power of Storytelling. This panel is a part of the Comer, author of Marvel's Avengers Assembly #1, and in the Star Wars The Clone Wars Stories of Light and Dark, both out this August. Joining me today are L.L. McKinney, author of the Nightmareverse series, Hafsa Faizal, author, and Alex London, author of the Skybound saga. To start off, I'd love to go down the line.
Hi everyone, I'm very excited to be here today, and I am the author of We Hunt the Flame, which released last year. It's a YA fan masquerades as a huntress when she hunts for her people in this scary forest that no one else has ever returned from. And so her life changes when she embarks on the world, and at the same time we have the Prince of the Kingdom, who is an assassin sent on a similar mission to find her, kill her, and retrieve the artifact for his father. So that came out last year, and then the sequel, We Free the Stars, releases January 2021.
Alex, next.
Black Wings Beating, the sequel, Red Skies Falling, and the third book in the trilogy. But Black Wings Beating is an epic fantasy series set in a world of cutthroat falconry, where birds of prey are revered and worshipped and used and exploited, and falconers are the most powerful people in the society, and it's the story of a brother and sister in that world who are compelled, coerced to go on a quest to capture the giant, mythic, psychic killer eagle that killed their father. They go into the mountains after this huge bird for their own reasons, for love, for vengeance, for atonement, and they're pursued by those seeking one thing: power, love, and regret, and giant killer birds.
Elle?
Yes, I wrote the Nightmareverse series, which starts with the A Blade So Black trilogy. That's this one, the sequel, A Dream So Dark. Both are out right now. And the third in the series is A Crown So Cursed. I don't know if you can see that. A Crown So Cursed, which comes out now in April. I'm sorry, everybody, but life is happening. And those books are about a girl who crosses into a darker version of Wonderland to slay monsters. And it pretty much can be summed up in what if Buffy fell down.
Hi everyone, I'm Katie Rose Poole, and I'm the author of There Will Come a Darkness, which is about a world that used to be guided by the 7 prophets, and the book takes place 100 years after the prophets have disappeared, leaving behind a final prophecy that predicts an age of darkness. And the book is about these 5 characters who are all involved in this prophecy, and they don't know whether they're going to be the ones to stop the age of darkness or to start it. So, and there's like a lot of other problems that they're dealing with at the same time. So, you know, you have your problems with your family and loved ones, and then you have an apocalypse.
So all those books sound amazing. So if anybody wants to pause and go like take a break and go read them really fast and then come back if you haven't already read them, you can do that because we're at home and you can pause this panel. So I talked to all of you about the genre and kind of what you find powerful. And I guess we let's start with Elle first.
Okay, this is what I get for opening my mouth. Huh? So I have always loved science fiction and fantasy. I read primarily genre fiction in order to escape. In case you haven't noticed, the world tends to be on fire a lot. I was, hunting for that door into Narnia or some other world just to get away for however many hundreds of pages I could. And growing up, fantasy and science fiction didn't really love me back. We were not there unless, we were being killed and barely allowed aboard the Millennium Falcon. And it was taken from us. Like, we were the original owners. This dude, wanted, anyway. So I grew up not really being able to articulate how that felt. And when I came of, age where I could find the words and understand the words and say just how that made me feel and that it was a problem, my sisters were having kids. And so I was like, you know what? I'm not going to let it happen to them. There will be at least one book with a girl. Now we have many more covers and it's amazing. We need 10 times as many, but that's why I got into science fiction and fantasy. It's because I loved it, and I refused to be ignored by it.
So yeah, I was drawn to fantasy for similar reasons. Mostly because when I picked up contemporary, I could never see myself. It was high school and drama and family problems and first crushes and all these things that I didn't really face because one, I was Muslim, two, my parents are immigrants and I was homeschooling and I had really no way to connect to it. In fantasy, I there are more often something that not everyone could not really connect to anyway. And so it kind of leveled the playing field for me, and that's basically why I was drawn to it.
So just grew up loving fantasy. I had an older brother who would play Dungeons and Dragons, and I would literally just there were these books. I think, just worlds that are so different from our own was so appealing to me. And I think also being able to read about adventure, because it's not something you can just ride off on a quest to do in the real world, but in a fantasy book, you can just find the magical key, defeat the evil sorcerer or whatever, and your world is saved. And I think there's something super cathartic about that, especially when you're a kid and you're just starting to learn about the world and about all the problems with the world and how kind of overwhelming that feels. And so I feel like fantasy was sort of a refuge of this idea that it is possible to save a world. It is possible to change things. Whether you have magical powers or not, there is sort of a way to go out and do those things. And so I feel like that was really powerful to me as a kid.
I similarly, I felt like when my early, sci-fi and fantasy reading, I felt like those books took me seriously. I had all these big emotions and conflicted feelings, and the fantasy books made them valid in a way. Growing up, of being afraid of that one dark crack in ways when you're young and everything's new. And I felt like fantasy took that seriously and said, yeah, no, that is a whole nother world on that side, and go to it and you can have an adventure. So I was always drawn to it, but it was always so just crushingly heterosexual. And I felt like, oh, these writers can imagine, worlds of talking mice and elaborate feasts, because I love the Redwall books, and they can imagine, dragons, but they can't imagine a queer person as heroic. And that was annoying. So similarly, to fill a hole in my own reading life, I wanted to write those same kinds of stories that I loved, that took young people seriously and had big ideas and big philosophies, but also that could make space for all kinds of people having all kinds of adventures. And I also liked it because fantasy, I think, forces readers to grapple with their assumptions about the world and about this world being the only possible world, and saying no, this is assumptions about the world and about myself. I mean, I come to writing as a cis white man, and I have to grapple with that. And if I can't imagine a world where my privilege is deconstructed, how am I going to create, a new world? So I have to that challenge.
So I guess I have kind of a two-part follow-up question to that, because there's a lot you all talked about, both in terms of world building and what fantasy was and what it could be. So I guess the first part is, many parts of fantasy do tend to be allegories and ways for us to discuss what's going on in the real world without necessarily pulling the actual real world into it. So how do you pull that into your narrative without losing the fantastical, and how do you balance those elements? And then the second part, which I will repeat this because fantasy was heavily produced through a very specific lens, which is white, cis, male, straight, and there's this significant coding that happened, dark-skinned or queer-coded characters as villains, for example. How can you speak to how your work was impacted by that, and how writers today can subvert those ideas in their own work? So the first part, how do you balance the allegorical with the real issues that you want, the fantasy and the allegory? How do you balance those two parts?
So, I have a huge issue with allegorical issues popping up in books, because very often, I very rarely see it done correctly. Nobody addresses the fact that these allegories, like how you have, magicians or magic being dangerous, or mutants when you have like X-Men or whatever. People can light you on fire with their brain and they are actually dangerous. Black people, other people of color are not. So the comparison is problematic of its own. To make an allegory, because until you can show on the page that the world is beyond that and what that looks like and how people act, because people would act very differently to a prejudice if prejudice had been stamped out prior. If there was that groundwork laid prior, it wouldn't look like the way it looks like in our world. And so people map our world onto that and then be like, oh, racism isn't a thing. You can't do that. So I don't try to make it different, because I feel that does a disservice to rules of this one. So they're gonna bring their own baggage to them. And if you say, hey, I've just wiped this out because I didn't want to discuss it the way that it actually is, I'm likely to put the book down and walk. I answered the question by saying that I don't do that. Like,
I think that's
if
good.
There's gonna be problems, they're gonna show up in the book the way that they are, and you gonna get this work. That's all I can say.
Yeah, I don't really do allegory deliberately. I think I'm always writing about power, where it comes from, how it moves, and there will be echoes with our world, because I'm still writing about humans, even if they're in an imaginary secondary world fantasy, and really, like commentary. I think that can be the death of story. So yeah, I don't do it on purpose.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that as well. I think that I never really go into a book thinking like, okay, I'm going to talk about these issues, but in a fantastical way. Like, that's just not really how fantasy writing works for me. But I do feel that, no matter what you are writing about, those issues from the real world do seep into your work. And I think it's our job as writers to acknowledge that, notice it, and try to deconstruct it through the narrative, rather than just pretending it's not happening or not noticing it at all. And I feel like that is the challenge of writing fantasy, but also kind of the joy of it is that it does give us a different challenge, the assumptions that exist in contemporary life, and think about, what would the world look like if, this had happened instead of that, if this, if the world was just shaped a different way. Like, speaking to the second part of your question, like, we are so used to these fantasy narratives, so many stories that aren't from that perspective. And so I think if you're a writer and you're thinking about, okay, well, I'm coming from my perspective, how can I, try to deconstruct that, try to see beyond that? I think reading those other stories is really where you need to start.
Yeah, so just like everyone else, I don't go into writing with the idea of introducing allegories or any of that. But when I started writing We Hunt the Flame, I set in a Eurocentric world, and I was making it very Eurocentric with like Welsh names, Welsh places. It was just a typical fantasy, because at the time, diverse books were just like starting to gain traction. And so I started writing the book, and then I reached about a third of it when I realized, and so when I started putting together the world's map, I realized that I can introduce a world that is often demonized in the media or romanticized in the media. You have Middle Eastern people, Arabs, displayed and portrayed as terrorists, or in fantasy, they're often mercenaries where they have no law, and you put a coin in their pocket, and then they'll fight for you and do whatever violent deed you want them to do. Belly dancers or voiceless creatures that you can just do whatever you want with them. And so when I started writing the book, I knew that I wanted to portray a world that was not either of those, that is just another world where thousands of people just live, and that they can have adventures, and they can slay the dragon, and they can fall in love. And there can be good people in this place, and there can be villains also, because they're just people. So that was, I didn't exactly go into it, so there's no allegory there, but it was something I was conscious of when I was crafting the world and writing the story. Just that I wanted to make other about the monsters that the media tells you there.
So, Katie, you kind of spoke to this a little bit, but for everyone else, for that second part of the question of, this long tradition within fantasy that is a very specific lens for writers today who, we always say read, 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 and we would like them to read the newer stories, but how can, outside of reading these kind of more inclusive, those kinds of ideas in their own work, and how was your work impacted?
I don't think you can subvert it. Sorry. I don't think you can subvert it if you're not reading the stuff that does it. Because our imaginations are kind of programmed by the world that we live in. And we're changing that gradually. But unless it goes this way with representation as well as with method and, execution, unless you see how it is done, or unless you see somebody make the attempt, what tells you it can be that way? Particularly from a creative standpoint. And people know certain things because they've seen it before, or they've seen maybe a glimpse of it. So I think you do have to read the new stuff. You have to read the stuff that's by marginalized people and at these intersections as well. Otherwise, it's just the same old, and we emulate what we see, whether we want to or not. It's why we have to, deconstruct internal biases. It's all the same. It shows up on the page, whether we mean for it to or not. As far as subverting it in my own work, I don't go in with the plan to be like, I'm going to take this trope and flip it on its head. I go in with the plan, I'm going to take this trope out there and just changing that perspective of who it's intended for, and the person behind it is going to do some of the inversion itself. As long as you have same traps as everybody else. We've been drinking the Kool-Aid too, so just coming at it from that slight perspective without getting into lots of workshop nitty-gritty type stuff. If you adjust your telling the story based on who you are, as opposed to based on what the world tells you are, it's a good starting point, in my opinion.
And I think I started with the thought, looking back at the past, realizing how little I knew. We're exposed to the popular stuff. We're taught the canon stuff, but there is a whole world of people who have been writing all kinds of stories and pushing against these things. We're not the first people to grapple with these problems. Nothing's that new. And so looking back and realizing just because you haven't heard of them doesn't mean they're not out there. People stumbled across an essay of hers, and that kind of gave me the spark for Black Wings Beating. I was thinking, okay, I've written some sci-fi and fantasy by the time I'm doing this, and it was all, even though I had queer characters, there was nothing particularly queer about the narrative itself. And I was like, how do I do more than just write queer heroes? I want to queer the idea of heroism that I've inherited about, going into the mountains and stabbing stuff until it's dead. What can a heroine do, or why women can't write? That was the title. And it was about her trying to write feminist sci-fi and fantasy in the 70s within the framework of the patriarchy. And she said this thing that blew my mind. She was talking about how we all learn to tell stories, how we learn, exposition, right, orgasm, and how the patriarchy was baked into the very way we learn to tell stories. And I was like, oh my God, how am I going to write? Even within that structure, I'm trapped with the bones of the story. So in thinking about that gave me the idea of I want to find a different structure. And watching a hawk circle, I was like, this was really exciting. It was hunting something. And so falconry became, and kind of birds became this not just the quest story that we inherited in a very specific kind of Western writing. But the idea to break out of that certainly didn't come from me.
Yeah, I really love that notion of not just the content and what the story is saying, but the structure itself is something that we can look at critically and think about where did this come from? Why is this the way that's prescribed to us that we should tell stories this way? And if you think about it, it is a lot of just, straight cis white men telling stories. These tell stories. And I think that is something that, as fantasy writers, we do kind of have some freedom to break out of those structures.
But I think we have to be super careful, right? Because when you're breaking into, especially, you know, as white people, when you're going into some other tradition, you got to make sure you're not trampling through someone's graveyards or temples, right? Like, you've got to be
100%. Yeah. I mean, just thinking and like not trying to take on anyone else's view of that, of what storytelling is, but to think about, you know, how you can sort of create your own.
I don't really have anything better to input than these guys. So
I mean, I really love that idea of kind of recognizing your influences and pushing up against them and seeing what something new you can come up with. You know, a big part of fantasy and something I wanted to chat with you guys about was world building. You know, it's different for everyone, and you all have these incredible worlds that you've built in the text that you've written. And so how do you start creating those worlds? Like, what is your point of entry when you're drafting? And then once you've read, Hafsa, do we want to start with you?
Yeah, so as I said before, I started writing We Hunt the Flame in a Eurocentric world, and it wasn't until about the third of the story when I realized that I had to change that. So that I slowly figure out as I continue to write, which is a very lengthy process, but it's the only way I can make it work. So for me, the world is the most important part, especially because it became something closer and dearer to me when I started crafting this world inspired by ancient Arabia, where I didn't want to, as I said, demonize or romanticize it. And I also wanted to stay away from mythology, which was like genies in a lamp and magic carpets. And we had so much of that. And we had so much of that written by white people that I just didn't want to do it. I wanted to create a history of my own, government of my own, politics, and all of that that was unique to the story, the same way that J.R. Tolkien could do it in Lord of the Rings, or any of these white authors could do in their own stories, where they didn't just adhere to myths and legends, and otherwise we'd have a ton of King Arthur stories, I guess. So I just wanted, so the world is most important to me, and the characters come second, but the characters also shape the world. So it's like once you get through the first draft, everything sort of meshes together and gets stronger on there as I go through edits.
Who wants to jump in next?
For me, I do kind of start with character usually, and that is my way into the world I fear the most. And so thinking about how those two ideas function and I also think a lot about history as sort of, you know, what is the world that I'm building now and how did that come to be? I studied history in college, so I feel like those questions are always in my mind when I'm world building, and especially not just how did it come to be, but what are the stories that people tell about how it came to be and how is that different from the truth? Because I think that's something that is in any study of history. You see, here's what we're told, here's what actually happened, and they're two different things. One of the first things that I think about when it comes to world building.
Yeah, I sort of think all writing is world building. You're writing a contemporary novel, you're still world building. You're picking which details to show and which not to show and who to include. And every act of writing is working with your reader's assumptions, right? Which goes to Elle's thing about like, who are you writing for, right? Your readers are gonna bring different set of assumptions depending on how you conceive of them. And so, you know, if I say there's a hill, I'm picturing a hill, you're picturing a hill, and hopefully somewhere our hills match. If you're writing a contemporary novel, maybe it doesn't matter so much if our hills, because it's just gonna look like a hill, whatever. But if I'm writing a fantasy novel and it's like a sentient hill that eats souls or something, like I'm gonna have to get a little more specific and describe it a little more and build it out a little more. So it's all writing is just managing reader assumptions and changing them a bit. So when those are different assumptions, and you have to kind of unpack those assumptions a little more, depending how strange your world is and how different it is from our own. So I think of it as adding degrees of strangeness, and the more degrees of strangeness from our world you add, the more chance you have of pulling your reader out of the narrative. So you have to use your strangeness sparingly. So that's kind of where I start. I think of like, what makes this world different? And then from there, I ask myself, who has power? How do they keep it? And what are the things in this world that everybody knows? Maybe not the things that are true, but the things that like everyone knows. And kind of from those questions, the rest kind of follow. And then as I'm writing, I discover in my first draft more about the world, and then I go back and and then go back and fix it and actually make it make logical sense with itself.
I too am not much of a plotter. I'm a pantser or a plotzer, I guess, like a headlights writer. Like I'll have an idea and only ever do what I can see, you know, in this little radius of illumination. I always start with the character. The character informs the world by their actions and how they interact with people, what they do or don't say and why they do or don't say it. Like for instance, with Alice, I didn't know until she bit down on wanting to say something about another character's past that, oh, okay, so this is a thing that people don't like to talk about. Cool, let's find out why. Like, you know, I don't know any of this. So I'll have a draft that might be shorter, might be longer, but it's there and it's messy. And then I go back and I'll pull a plot out of that. And that's when the world building really starts. Because I like to surprise myself as I'm going along. Because if I'm surprised, chances are you were surprised. Or if you're smarter than me, you maybe figured out what I didn't know about my own book going in, which has happened. So I always start with the character, sort of reveal what's going on bit by bit. And then I'll go in and, like The Sims, I'll move stuff around if I don't like that it's over here, or maybe it's backwards, or maybe it's bigger, or it shouldn't be in there at all, you know. So my world building starts with interaction with this other world that I've built up. And of course, I'm drawing from an already existing canon somewhat, so I've got that in the back of my mind as well with Wonderland. And I always wanted to take not the story itself, but just sort of use it and themed pillows on the couch, but the rest of it is pulled from those two pillows on the couch somehow. I don't know how it's done. It's sorcery. That's like internal design, but in my mind, that's how it works. If I was to actually do that, the room would look a mess. So this is why I write and I don't do internal design.
So something that we've kind of touched on a little bit, are, you know, within the history and the canon and whatnot, are the ideas of tropes. And I love a good trope. I love, like, I'm a sucker for enemies to lovers, or like the magical girl. Like, I love it. So I want to know, what are some of your favorite tropes? Katie, let's start with you.
The first thing that I thought of is anything in a fantasy world where someone with either the day or using that skill to save the day. I love that trope. I just, the sort of way that it flips on your head, like what you're thinking about, like, you know, what heroes do and what they are and how they treat people, and to flip that on its head to be like, no, here's this, you know, humble hobbit who's going to save the day or whatever.
Alex.
I mean, enemies to lovers is a good one. I've never written it, but it's intimidating. I'm writing a middle grade novel right now, and it is impossible to be writing a middle grade novel while watching this show that is the perfect middle grade story. I'm just like, oh, I'll never be that good.
Yeah.
Yep.
So every trope in that, basically. Oh, Zuko. I know he's an animated, imaginary 16-year-old, but also I have
Zuko.
That's creepy. I'm not gonna. That's what therapy is for. But I actually, so one of my favorite tropes that I love reading, I love writing, like the One Ring, or like connection with a dragon or a giant psychic bird. That like unrequited longing. I think it's such an authentic emotion. Well, I love that. I love the idea of longing to like ride a dragon and or like to wear a powerful ring or whatever that or to like find a mystical land.
Where essentially you have the group like the Sailor Scouts or the Power Rangers, or the crew in Avatar: The Last Airbender, although they fluctuate between 4 to 6 sometimes, it depends. But I love when you have that group dynamic because they play off of each other really, really well, and they can bring aspects of the world because they come to arc puts in. And so you get this, you know, villain that, you know, makes this grand gesture of dying to do the one right thing he could have done in his life. And it's like, could you did that before all the horrible stuff? Maybe. I don't know. We never get to see you grow. I mean, he's good, all right, for now. Maybe we'll see how long that lasts, guy.
For me, it's definitely enemies to lovers, and then found family, which I didn't know about the fans.
What are some pop culture or literary influences that inspired your books specifically? And Elle, I'm gonna.
I've read the book and you don't pick up on the fact that I love Sailor Moon. I don't know what to tell you.
Rising one that like you don't often talk about, like an influence that a lot of people don't see.
Video games really influence my stuff, mostly because you get the 5-man band in there. I'm heavily influenced by Dragon Age, just the entire saga, because of how I'm playing those games. Because that's all you get. If you're not out killing stuff and, you know, hunting like 36 of them, because 36 is somebody's lucky number, I don't know. You mostly spend most of your time like talking to people and selecting which react, you know, all like the game ends differently depending on how all of these things, the style of anime in general, just the tropes from anime, like the beach episode and the festival episode, the filler episode. I love me some good filler. I do. I love it. And everybody's like, oh, the plot dragging this part. And I'm like, but they had fun, okay? Leave them alone. So I love some good. So those are my influences: Dragon Age, video games in general, but good RPG games, Sailor Moon, and anime filler episodes.
Hafsa?
I'm seconding the video games because there's a heavy influence of Assassin's Creed in my story, particularly for the assassin character who is the prince and the second protagonist of the story. Just the parkour and the gauntlet blades, and the story was also inspired by a back-to-back consumption of Lord of the Rings and the Hunger Games, where my sisters and I were like, what if the Hunger Games was set in a fantasy world? And that was basically how the story started and evolved into something else. So, but I think if you look closely, you might see like the nods to the Hunger Games and Lord of the Rings. But my favorite influence is definitely Assassin's Creed.
Alex?
So Lord of the Rings was a big influence, and a little bit Game of Thrones. But the one that probably that especially in the second and third book, Red Skies Falling and Golden's Rising, the Iliad, which was a huge influence, weirdly. And my husband was a classicist, and he doesn't really read fantasy. But when he read those, he said, this one chapter really reminded me of book 8 of the Iliad. And it like was this good nice to be appreciated.
Yeah, I always struggle to answer this question because I feel like the answer is like literally everything I've ever consumed from when I was 8 to now. But I think definitely Game of Thrones was an influence, just in that it was the first time that I read this sort of epic scope book with multiple points of view that had as much emphasis on character as it did on, you know, the plot and the big stakes. And so that was definitely a big influence for There Will Come a Darkness. Lord of the Rings, of course. I mean, everyone goes through those years where you're obsessed with those movies or books. And a lot of like older fantasy stuff that I had read when I was a kid. And I think, you know, there's certain
are out of time. So I want to say thank you to Elle, Hafsa, Katie, Alex. Do you want to just let everybody know where they can find you on social and what books they can buy, just as a reminder?
Sure. You can find me various places on social media. I'm particularly fond of Twitter, which is the nice way to say that I might have a slight problem. Just because I can say things, and if you go to my website, llmckinney.com, just how it is on the book, but only one dot. Don't put the other dots in there. I'm not responsible for what pops up if you do. You can find all of my other shenanigans across the internet. And start with this one. You can start with the other ones, but you won't know what's going on. So start with this one.
It's basically Amazon, Barnes and Noble, but you should purchase it from your indie bookseller because they need it.
Alex London. I've written YA, adult, middle grade, and a picture book. So, and all under slightly different versions of my name. So it's, my social is confusing. So just Google me and you'll find me. It's all out there. But yeah, Black Wings Beating. If you want to read some epic fantasy with killer birds and queer teens on quests, check it out. And then the second book is Red Skies Falling, and the third one is Gold Wings Rising.
Yeah, Katie Rose Poole. You can find me at Katie Poole on Twitter, Katie Rose Poole on Instagram, katierosepoole.com. There Will Come Darkness is already out. The sequel comes out in September, and you can buy them hopefully at your indie bookstore, but also anywhere else books are sold.
All right, well, thank you all so much. This was awesome. I'm so glad I got to moderate because you guys are all amazing. Thanks, everybody.